woman to run this institution, which is celebrating its 80th anniversary this year. The firsts are many, and we won't go through them all, but she was also the first Bulgarian to ever visit Fiji, which is always one of those fun factoids. Gorgieva, who calls herself an unwavering optimist, took over months before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I remember well how she spoke out at a G20 meeting in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, in February 2020 about the potential devastating consequences of the disease that was just starting, a scourge that ultimately has claimed over something like 7 million lives to date. At that time, in those very early days, other finance officials were downplaying the risks. Of course, we know what happened. And the IMF played a critical role in shaping the world's response. Since the pandemic, the IMF has provided about $1 trillion in liquidity and finance for its 190 members, soon to be 191. Gorgieva brings a different perspective to this job of running the IMF than her predecessors. And that, reflects her experience. She grew up in communist Bulgaria behind the Iron Curtain and knew what it meant to experience the deprivations of that system. She experienced firsthand the impact of structural reforms that she and that the institution prescribed. She wanted to study journalism, but was eventually accepted, but that was difficult to get into, I don't know why, but eventually was accepted into Bulgaria's Institute of Economics and quickly embraced the discipline as a useful way to understand and interpret our complicated world. It was like serendipity, really. She studied French, but went to Britain, later learning there about market economies, later writing the first textbook on microeconomics in Bulgaria, then working at the World Bank, then at the European Commission, returning to the World Bank to be its CEO, and since 2019, since October 1st, she's been the managing director here, just across the street, from the World Bank. Under her leadership, and I think many of you probably were in the room that day when she greeted the people here at the institution. Under her leadership, the IMF has adopted a first ever climate strategy, sustained its first long-term lending instrument, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And just last year, the IMF increased its quota shares to member countries by 50% on an equiproportional basis. It also has added a third sub-Saharan African chair to the IMF board. And as you know, she's raised her voice for gender equality. In fact, one of the first events that she did upon taking over was a very large and well-attended panel on gender. She's called for greater attention to climate change, and despite the responsibility she holds, still manages to spend time with her grandchildren, a granddaughter and a grandson. I'm honored to introduce her now to present a curtain raiser for next week's annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Please welcome Kristalina. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Very kind words. And good choice to sit down with the audience, because when I speak, we would have a chance to see visually some of the points I make, and you are very well seated to do so. 5 years ago, in this very hall, I delivered my first curtain raiser as head of the IMF. At that time, my main concern was synchronized slowdown in global growth. Only months later, it paled in comparison with the sudden shock of the pandemic, followed by other dramatic events, the tragic wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, the cost of living crisis, and further fracturing of the global economy. Next week, the world's finance ministers and the central bank governors will converge here to reflect on where we are, where we are headed, and what to do about it. and I would like to offer you a preview of what this conversation is likely to be. First, we will cherish the good news, and rightly so, because we haven't had much of it lately. The big global inflation wave is in retreat. A combination of resolute monetary policy action, easing supply chain constraints, and moderating food and energy prices is guiding us back in the direction of price stability. And this has been done without tipping the global economy into recession and large-scale job losses, something we saw during the pandemic and after past inflation episodes, and which many feared we would see again. But we didn't. Both in the US and Euro area labor markets, we see, just taking these two examples, we see cooling in an orderly manner. And let's pause and recognize this is a big achievement. Where did this resilience come from? Answer: from strong policy and institutional foundations built over time, and from international policy cooperation as countries learn to act fast and act together. We are benefiting from central bank independence in advanced economies and in many emerging markets. We are benefiting from years of prudential reforms in banking, from progress made in building fiscal institutions, and progress made in capacity development worldwide. But despite the good news, don't expect any victory parties next week, for at least 3 reasons. Well, one, inflation rates may be falling, but the higher price level that we all feel in our wallets is here to stay. Families are hurting, people are angry. Advanced economies saw inflation rates at once-in-a-generation highs, and that memory is not going to be erased rapidly. So did many emerging market economies. But look at how bad the situation was for low-income countries. At the country level and at the level of individuals, inflation always hits the poor the hardest. Well, 2, and even worse, we are in a difficult geopolitical environment. We are all very worried about the expanding conflict in the Middle East and its potential to destabilize regional economies and global oil and gas markets. Its humanitarian impact, alongside the prolonged wars in Ukraine and wars elsewhere, is heartbreaking, and it is harming confidence in the world economy. And on top of it all, this is happening at a time when our forecasts point to an unforgiving combination of low growth and high debt, a difficult future. Let's take a closer look. Medium-term growth is forecast to be lackluster, not sharply lower than pre-pandemic, but far from good enough. Not enough to eradicate world poverty, nor to create the number of jobs we require, nor to generate the tax revenues that governments need to service heavy debt loads, while attending to vast investment needs, including for the green transition. This picture is made more troubling by high and rising public debt, way higher than before the pandemic. Even after the brief but significant fall in debt to GDP as inflation lifted nominal GDP. And do please notice the shaded area on this chart. What it shows is that in severe but plausible adverse scenario, debt could climb some 20 percentage points of GDP above our baseline. What does it mean for fiscal space? To answer this question, let's look at the share of government revenue consumed by interest payments. This is where high debt, high interest rates, and low growth come together, because it is growth that generates the revenue governments need to function and invest. As debt increases, fiscal space contracts disproportionately more in low-income countries. Not all debt burdens are made equal. And fiscal space keeps shrinking. Just look at the frightening evolution of the interest-to-revenue ratio over time. We can immediately see how the tough spending choices have become tougher, with higher debt payments hanging on our heads. Schools or climate? Digital connectivity or roads and bridges? This is what it comes down to, making these tough choices. And to make matters worse, we live in deeply troubled times. The peace dividend from the end of the Cold War that Andrea talked about, I experienced on the colder side of it, is increasingly at risk. In a world of more wars and more insecurity, defense expenditures may well keep rising while aid budgets fall further behind the growing needs of developing countries. Not only is development assistance too small, but major players, driven by national security concerns, are increasingly resorting to industrial policy and protectionism, creating one trade restriction after another. Going forward, trade will not be the same engine of growth as before. It is the fracturing I warned of back in 2019, right from this very place. Except it is worse. It is like pouring cold water on already lukewarm world economy. So what is my message today? My message today, we can do better. As Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank across the street, often says, forecasts are not destiny. There is plenty we can and must do to lift our growth potential, reduce debt, and build a more resilient world economy. Let me start with actions domestically, actions at home. Governments must work to reduce debt and rebuild buffers for the next shock, which will surely come and may come sooner than we expect. Budgets need to be consolidated credibly, yet gradually in most countries. This will involve difficult choices on how to raise revenues and make spending more efficient, while also making sure that policy actions are well explained to earn the trust of the people. Here is the problem, though. Fiscal restraint let me ask you this. Have you seen fiscal restraint ever popular in a country? People say, hooray, we are going to have fiscal restraint. It is not popular. And as a new paper by IMF staff shows, it is only getting harder. So this is what we learned. Across a wide sample of countries, political discourse increasingly favors fiscal expansion. Even the traditionally fiscally conservative political parties are developing a taste for borrow to spend. Fiscal reforms are not easy, but they are necessary, and they can enhance opportunity and inclusion. And we know from experience in countries, they actually can be done. With political will, they can be done. When we look at the medium term, where is the key? The key is growth, to deliver jobs, tax revenues, fiscal space, and debt sustainability. Very simple. The solution to low growth, high debt is high growth. So when I go, any place I go, what I hear is this aspiration: can we get our growth potential up? Can we create more opportunities? And the question is, how? Answer: we know it. Focus on reforms and recognize there is no time to waste. First area of reforms: make job markets work for people. We confront a world of deeply uneven demography. Surging young populations in some places, aging societies elsewhere. Economic migration can help, but only up to a point, given the anxieties in many countries. So too could supportive steps to help get more women into the workforce. But the most critical task is reforms to enhance skill sets and match the right people with the right jobs. Second area, mobilize capital. There is abundance of it globally. Tim, you would confirm that, plenty of money, but often not in the right places or right types of investments. Just think of all the money from all corners of the globe poured into liquid but less productive assets in a few major financial centers. Putting savings to work for maximum economic benefit requires policymakers to focus on eliminating barriers such as weak investment environments, shallow capital markets, and financial sector oversight must not only ensure stability and resilience, but also encourage prudent risk-taking and value creation. By the way, a message also for us at the fund. Third area, enhance productivity. Well, this is what yields more output per unit of input, and there are many ways to raise it, from improving governance and institutions to cutting red tape to harnessing the power of artificial intelligence. More and better spending on education and R&D. Among advanced economies, those that lead on innovation show what works. Venture capital industries, ecosystems that bring not only financing, but knowledge, advice, and professional networks, screening new ideas, identifying winners, feeding them from birth to graduation. And these lessons can be learned by everyone. What we have seen over the last years, tragically, is that the pace of reform has been slowing since the global financial crisis, as discontent has risen. But progress is possible. We have a new study that shows that resistance to reforms is often driven by beliefs and misperceptions about the reforms themselves, as well as the distributional effects of these reforms. How can we best develop them? Well, two-way dialogue with the public, with measures to mitigate the impact of those who risk losing out. We have learned how much this matters over the last years. And as policymakers pursue reforms at home, they also need to look outward. There is so much countries can do together as members of the integrated economic community, each benefiting from its own comparative advantage. Each benefiting from the forces of technology, trade, and capital mobility that have delivered an incredible degree of interconnectedness. Yet still we live in a mistrustful, fragmented world where national security has risen to the top of the list of concerns for many countries, has risen for many understandable and good reasons. This has happened before, but it never happened at the time of such economic codependency. So my argument is that we must not allow this reality to become an excuse to do nothing to prevent a further fracturing of the global economy. Quite the opposite. My appeal during these annual meetings will be, let's work together in an enlightened way to lift our collective prospects. Let us not take the global tensions as given, but rather resolve to work to lower the geopolitical temperature and attend to the tasks that can only be tackled together. Trade, which has lowered prices, improved quality, created jobs, and is still showing remarkable resilience in the face of new barriers, often flowing around them via third countries. But we need to recognize redirection can only take us that far, and we cannot assume it will continue indefinitely. So we have to get on the page of protecting what works well in our trade system. Second, and this one is truly existential, climate. Countries that contribute the least to it are the most negatively impacted. Unexpected global warming moving actually faster than we thought. You read every book and it says, oops, we were wrong, it is worse. Glaciers melting, ice cap crumbling, average weather events have telegraphed a frightening message from the future. We know what we must do. Create fiscal space for the green transition, eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, get capital to where it is most needed. And three, artificial intelligence, our single best shot at a higher productivity. If it is managed well, it has the potential to lift world growth by up to 0.8 percentage points. With that alone, we are likely to not only reach our pre-pandemic higher average growth, but even potentially exceed it. Yet what we need is we need regulatory and ethical codes that are fundamentally global. Why global? Because AI is borderless. It's already on smartphones everywhere. I have a question for you. How many of you have ChatGPT on your phones? Raise your hand. How many of you don't have it? Okay, so there is some way to go, but it is not going to wait. This technology is not going to wait. Those of you who have not raised your hands, please, go ahead, catch up. Bottom line is that there are areas where we need to work together, and sometimes we need to relearn to work together. And we at the IMF, we are born from this basic idea: pool resources, everybody is better off. We have a role to play. Andrea has already mentioned in my first term, it was anything but boring. It was a really hard time, and we have done a lot. We have injected historically high liquidity a trillion, you mentioned this number, more important than the money, we kept our membership together so they can synchronize policy action at a time of very high uncertainty. And now we are in the first days of my second term. We deliver. Again, our executive board, in full consensus, not a single abstention, approved important reforms that reinforce our strong financial position and directly benefit the membership, reducing charges and surcharges on our regular lending, putting in place a comprehensive package to secure our concessional lending capacity to support low-income countries. And I see quite a number of people who have worked on that, Bernard, Jayla. It was a very heavy lift, but it got done. Andrea mentioned we are going to have a third board member for Sub-Saharan Africa. I can disclose that this new chair would be held by Côte d'Ivoire, and that ensures more voice for underrepresented region. And when we look at all this, the quarter increase, the actions we have taken, what they do is they give us the strength to continue to deliver high value added to a membership that engages not out of charity, but self-interest. And it is this value that brought our membership to grow. Now we are welcoming very warmly the Principality of Liechtenstein as our 191st member. So when I go back to the founding of the Bretton Woods in the dark days of 1944 to today, what we have established is a tradition of adapting to the changing world around us. And today you have my word. This will continue. We will stand with our members, always looking for the most impactful way to serve. Now, by the time I complete my second term at the helm of the IMF, I will have led it for almost the whole of this decade. And if I am granted one wish, it would simply be this. Let this decade be remembered not as one where we allowed conflicts to get in the way of existential tasks, storing up vast costs and misery for those who would follow. Let it be remembered as a time when we rose above our differences for the good of all, for our mutual prosperity, and ultimately for our survival. I say, we can do better. Let there be peace on earth, and let cooperation flourish. We can do better. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
So we are together here.
Yes, terrific. Now we get a chance to ask questions, which is my favorite part. Thank you so much for that overview. I did want to sort of go into the big picture here. You know, clearly the global economy is facing tremendous uncertainty. You mentioned rising tensions in the Middle East, where we've seen just dreadful, horrific pictures in recent days and over the past year. There's Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, rising protectionism. The chart was seeing that, the trade restrictions is pretty shocking, I have to say, seeing it visualized like that. We're also seeing major devastating weather events and with increasing frequency. And of course, you know, we're here in the United States where an election will decide many things in just a few weeks. As you prepare for these annual meetings next week, how worried are you about the global economy and the headwinds that we face? I mean, it does seem like the challenges are daunting and the risks are on the downside.
This is a very interesting situation we find ourselves to be, because it combines better than expected performance of the world economy and risks to the downside. So when we are assessing the situation, what I want to emphasize is that incredible resilience we have demonstrated, Andrea, over the last years, and especially in this last year when we were fighting inflation, it does come from years and years and years of investing in strong institutions and also investing in the world having channels of communication, ability to engage. And this investment, I don't think is gone. It actually, we will see it next week continuing. My expectation is that we will see governors and ministers coming here, living outside their differences. I mean, the line I would use is leave your trade war out, leave your Cold War out. If, God forbid, if you have a hot war, leave it out. And if you have a proxy war, leave it out. And engage on the important policy choices that I just outlined that are very pressing for us. It's a mixed picture. When you look at the world, and just in a couple of days we will come with the growth projections, what we see is, compared to historical performance, China is slowing down, India is accelerating, and some other parts of Asia accelerating. The US is doing quite well. Europe can do better. So in that picture, I think the issue that would dominate is, are we going to ride on the opportunities that we are presented with by technology and by the instruments of collaboration we have built, or we would retreat to a worse position? You heard me. I think each and every one of us, in whatever we do, institutionally, individually, we have a very important responsibility. I hope the media would take it as well, to work for doing better. And in that sense, I'm not super pessimistic, because if you look at the trajectory of the world economy, yeah, we can do better, but we can also do much worse. So we will see how the conversation goes. My expectation is people would leave from here somewhat uplifted, somewhat more scared, hopefully scared to get them into high gear to act. We will do our part to bring both, look, get more scared, but hey, there are things you can do. Go back home, do them.
Well, that brings me to another question, which is you've outlined ways that policymakers can bolster what you call lackluster growth forecasts by improving their fiscal situation, whether that's through raising taxes, reducing and boosting revenues, reducing debt, enhancing productivity. But, you know, as your paper shows, doing that is hard, really hard to get through. What's your advice when you meet with the ministers from countries that, you know, need to implement those often very painful reforms?
In 2 words, buckle up. I lived in a country that has gone through tremendous structural transformation. It is painful, but then you reap off the benefits from it. And when you look around the world, there are these shining examples. I mean, look at Brazil. Brazil started in 2017 reforms of the labor market, then they went into tax reforms, value-added tax reforms. What we see from the data is that growth in Brazil is boosted by somewhere between 0.3, 0.5%. That is significant. Or you look at the performance of India over the years. Remarkable. India was a country in the 90s where you cannot make a step forward because of red tape. Everything needs to be permitted. Permits require, they breed corruption. The country doesn't move. Look at India today. It is a bright spot on the world horizon. So the question really is how to generate that determination and then go to work. That's, I do not want anybody to walk out of here thinking that it is doom and gloom. It is difficult. But there are actions that have been taken by others. You can do it as well.
Okay. I have to say that it's difficult not to be pessimistic or fatalistic about the low growth, high debt conundrum. I mean, it just seems like it's getting worse. So, given the high levels of uncertainty, all the risks in the geopolitical environment, where do you see opportunities for hope? You mentioned AI. How significant of a factor can that be, and can we shift the momentum there on this debt issue?
So there are, on the issue of that, there are three things that need to be done. In countries that are in situation that is not sustainable, we know what needs to be done. That needs to be restructured. I am encouraged to see speeding up the restructuring process. The Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable is helping to get consensus on some of the policy issues. Ethiopia, if you look at the speed with which Ethiopia moved to restructuring vis-a-vis the first country, Chad, it is night and day. The second thing that needs to be done on debt is to get governments to think about their fiscal consolidation over time. We worry of too fast tightening because you have to find this balance between you're still supporting growth in the economy, but you're getting fiscal consolidation in place. We actually very actively and loudly tell countries, yes, consolidate credibly, but do it over time so you don't suffocate your growth potential. And three, there are things that can help economies to grow. I mean, look at the enormous impact of the green transition and the digital transformation. It is powering up parts of the world in a way that is just amazing. And then when I think about my concern around what is going on, the distance between those who do well and those who don't, unfortunately, is growing. So what we used to be in a world of convergence, now we are in a world of divergence. So pay attention not only to yourself, pay attention to others. And this is where this whole conversation about trade restrictions, industrial policy comes into play, because you throw cold water on the economies of others. Guess what? The world economy is shrinking. The pie of which you are part would get smaller. So a bit more rational design of policies, and this is where the fund comes, because what we can do is show what are the costs, what are the benefits, in the most transparent way for policymakers to make their mind. Again, Andrea, we can say, oh God, it's horrible. Let's go home and lie in bed and cover our heads and go to sleep. Or we can say, this is a tremendous challenge. Let's figure it out. When
during your first term, you pioneered some work that was important in terms of addressing the needs. You mentioned the RST, and also you helped set up the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable just to sort of help particularly China as the largest creditor, but others also work through the issues involved with debt restructuring. What's your next initiative? Where do you see opportunities really, or do you just keep?
I'll tell you. I mean, what we focus at the fund right now are three things. Number one, make sure that this soft landing we talk about actually happens everywhere. Because let's not forget, we have a fleet of soon to be 191 planes. They all have to land softly. You know, this is, I don't take that for given. So that work on helping countries with monetary policy, understanding what needs to be done, stays high. But then move the attention to the fiscal side and help countries in this fiscal consolidation that many of them have to do it wisely. Do it pro-growth, not growth suffocating. So that's one big thing. The second one is, if you come to the fund almost every day, there is a discussion around growth, structural reforms for growth, how do you lift up productivity, what we can learn from one country, transmit to the other. For us, yes, we are about monetary policy, macro stability, but let's remember our articles say for growth and employment. And we are very keen to see that ability of countries to grow enhanced by the support of the fund. And three, we are in a world where the changes technologically are so rapid that we risk new shocks to come for which we have a blind spot. Just think about technology affecting financial systems, cross-border payments, the way investments are managed. And that area of risk that is financial stability risk for us, for FSB, for BIS, for central banks, hugely, hugely important. So when you ask me what next for us, I'll tell you, I want the fund to be financially very strong, to anchor our members, and lean forward on the issues that matter to them. And one thing I'm extremely proud, we are financially strong, Andrea. The fund for years and years and years and years and years had a target for precautionary balances. This is what buffers us against risk in our portfolio. And we couldn't reach this target until April this year. So for the first time, I can say we walk our own talk. We tell countries build buffers. Here we are. Our buffer is really strong. So that's how, you know, I'm not thinking of big initiatives. I'm thinking about doing the business of our membership with agility, speed, and of course, quality of the work we do.
Terrific. So in advance of this event, we asked for some questions, and we've got 4 people that are going to ask questions that were selected. Let's start with you, Fred. Ken? We'll get the microphones to you.
Madam Managing Director, thank you for that really remarkable presentation. I want to, Fred Kemp from the Atlantic Council, I'd like to drill down on global trade. Your global trade alert, your quote, trade will not be the same engine of growth as before. You said that in 2019, you're saying it's worse. So my question is, how much worse is it getting? And you talked about we can do better. I wonder if you can get a little bit more specific. If you look, you know, a lot of countries see it in their self-interest, whether it's Chinese overcapacity exports, whether it's tariffs in the EU or the US. You know, self-interest sometimes overcomes what you're arguing for, which is global trade, you know, coming together. Where do we start? What changes this trajectory?
The first observation I would like to make, Fred, is that trade has slowed down, but has not gone into reverse. And when you look at the reason for it, it is primarily this very deep interdependence that has been built over decades. What is important to recognize is that it is now mostly advanced economies that are leading the way on restrictions. In the last 18 months, there have been 4,000 industrial policy measures that impact the kind of the free flow of trade. 4,000. 60% of them come from advanced economies. So can we work rationally to determine where this is genuinely grounded in national security concerns or in market failures? Yes. Jayla, who is sitting right next to you, her team just published a guidance note on industrial policy. So the job for us, and it defines when it is justified, when it is not, how do we measure costs and benefits, and how we build this in our regular surveillance work so we can help countries make decisions in the future that are grounded in sound analysis. This is our job. And then comes the reform of WTO. It is not going very fast, but it is also not dead. How can more momentum be built practically to make the WHO more acceptable for members? And the three, I put actually a lot of hope on that. What we see as regional cooperation. So you have the world cooling off a little bit on global cooperation, but at the same time, we see ASEAN, Gulf Cooperation Council, countries that are linked by interests, for example, some of the commodity producers. We see in Africa more interest in building Africa-wide free trade arrangements. So how can we use different pathways to build better prospects for growth on the basis of trade continuing to function, although it's not going to be the same engine of growth as it used to be. You, the Atlantic Council, you have also a role to play because you do a lot of this analysis of comparative performance. I think we have to be, one thing I would advise against is don't take it for granted that, oh, well, this is how it is. You know, make the analysis, show the arguments, better days would come. But these are the three things. One is make sure people understand the implications of measures they take, especially industrial policy measures, and we can help. Make sure that obstacles to the functioning of the global trade system related to WTO are removed, and look at the other drivers of collaboration and trade, especially in regional settings.
Let me just follow up on Fred's question, and then we'll go to a few more questions. But it occurs to me that, you know, when you talk about inflation coming down and prices staying up, it's one of the big drivers of the discontent. But isn't the same thing sort of true with trade restrictions, that once they're implemented, they're really hard to dismantle? Getting away, you know, going back is always harder.
Andres, one of the main messages of this industrial policy piece I mentioned is, it says, whatever you do, make it temporary. Yeah. Build an exit door. Don't make it so you cannot leave it. But you're right, occasionally this is the case. Since you mentioned inflation, why are we concerned about trade restrictions and protectionism? Because actually, who pays for it? Who pays for tariffs? It would be the businesses and the consumers, mostly in the country that has created the tariffs. And also what we see is that there is 3 out of 4, if this is to happen, in 3 out of 4 cases, there would be retaliation. So somebody's going to get hurt because of this. And I think our job is to show that you may have benefits here, but there may be costs there that outweigh these benefits, and help policymakers think through this.
So it's not a panacea.
No, it is not. I mean, there is no silver bullets in very short supply.
Terrific. Let's take a question from Homi Karas from Brookings, please.
Great to see you, Homi.
Thank you so much for the overview. So you talked about countries worrying about getting growth going again, and many countries are worried about the impact of climate on their growth, and they're looking to implement adaptation measures. At the same time, they're worried about the buildup of debt. So I just wanted to ask, how do you view balancing those two kinds of risks at the same time? And should we be using tools like cost-benefit analysis to say, this makes sense for adaptation spending? Much of that's going to have to be public spending, especially in developing countries.
We did a fairly thorough analysis on how to finance adaptation, mitigation, and the transition. And one obvious conclusion was you cannot borrow your way through this problem. It is not possible. So you have to think about ways in which, this is why I'm so much emphasizing the importance of growth. You have to find ways in which you bring more dynamism. And here is an interesting, and unless you do that, you are in this caught in catch-22. You do not have fiscal space to invest. As a result, you underinvest, and climate shocks are more damaging to you. What agitates me, honestly, is that there is so much that we know about the way to lift up productivity and growth. I mean, for God's sake, do it. Our staff says that, I mean, it's very interesting. They says that if countries decide to catch up with the United States, just 15% of the structural measures that are in place here, delivering higher productivity for the United States, they can generate just about a percentage point stronger growth in their economies. In a way, if there were no solutions, I would have said, oh well, doomed. But there are solutions, and we lack the courage, the determination, the political will to go for them. So the answer to your question is engage with the public, create more appetite for the reforms that ultimately would guarantee our survival.
Terrific. Let's go next to Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief at DevEx.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you, and I appreciate the optimistic message. I was with you a couple of years ago when you had one of these solutions that you delivered today, which is the fragile and conflict-affected states strategy of the IMF, the first time the IMF was playing in that arena. You talked today about the big divergence between countries and where low-income countries are in this very shrinking fiscal space, growing debt. I think half of them are at or near a debt crisis. What does it mean for fragile and conflict-affected states that the bilateral foreign aid is going down, that their debt situation is worse? I know we talk about a soft landing, but it feels like for them, they're in a very different place. What's the model for them? What is the solutions-oriented model to get them out of this moment?
We are working on a kind of a three-pronged approach as we engage with countries that face grave difficulties. One is to help them on the governance side, on the policy front, so they advance, they get better. The second one is to mobilize more assistance from others. We take our role to use programs, and we actually have now a record high number of programs, including in fragile states, so we can catalyze more funding for these countries. And three, recognize that the ultimate difficulty comes from conflicts and you know, the fact that there is no peace in some of these neighborhoods. And then what we do is we work with regional structures, we work with other organizations to bring forward attention to solving these problems. I mean, we are not a peace-building organization, but we have some convening capacity to get attention, to zero in on the Sahel, to zero in on the Horn of Africa, on Sudan, on countries that need more attention. I must say, it is very troubling that you would have a conflict like the one in Sudan, and it's not on Andrea's top list of stories to write. Yeah, that would be I mean, we do what we can to stabilize countries, and in some cases, there is progress. Take Somalia. Somalia was seen as sort of very difficult to pull out of the brink. Somalia is doing better, but unfortunately, the fragile country situation has not gotten in totality better. At the fund, we prioritize work there. We actually give people bonus points when they work in fragile states, because we want to work with those that need our help the most. We work with the bank very closely. We work with regional development banks to support these countries. And you're right, they do require all the attention the world can spare.
Let me just follow up on that, and then we'll take one more question and wrap it up. But you know, when you're talking about the kind of preparing for the next shocks, is it conceivable that the next shock is coming from an area of fragility? I mean, is it possible that we see, you know, generally the conventional wisdom is that these countries have very relatively small economies that don't impact the global economy. But you know, how do you assess that?
So first, let me say this. You asked me what, and I didn't quite answer your question, what I want to be my big thing in my second term. It is actually to teach us and then help our members to think of the unthinkable. Yeah. Because the unthinkable is going to happen. And we have to have and actually we are building this muscle, so we anticipate and then we respond quickly, and we lean forward, target the most vulnerable. Could that be unthinkable that comes from a small country? Of course, this is possible. If you get a small country developing terrorist capabilities in a world of technology where drones can go anywhere, yeah, small country can cause big trouble. Yes. So how do you counter that? Well, you counter it with the tools of development. You make it so that countries actually have opportunities and alternatives to doing something unthinkable. I was, as many of you know, I was humanitarian crisis commissioner for 5 years. This is what helped me to be a good managing director in my first term when COVID hit. Because this is what I was wired to do, think of the unthinkable.
Let's go now to Jordan Schwartz, who's Executive Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Thank you, Andrea. A question about cooperation, since that was the call for engagement at the end of your speech. I think over the course of your tenure at the fund, we've watched the institution evolve further from one focused traditionally on balance of payments adjustment, fiscal management, to one ever more concerned with the impact of finance, whether it is climate change or productivity or vulnerability and equity, some of the points that you've raised. And that's brought, I think, the IMF closer to the multilateral development banks and ourselves closer to the fund. I was just wondering if you could give us a sense of where you see collaboration going across the international financial institutions.
I mean, it is very important that institutions do what they're best at and do not venture in areas where they don't have comparative advantage. For us at the fund, what we are best at is to take the vital signs of each and every economy and then identify areas of risks and opportunities for these economies, in particular with regard to risks associated with balance of payment, which is our origin. But as the world has become more complex and interconnected, we cannot separate balance of payment needs from policy choices countries make. We have to think about those. And there we find it very useful to partner with organizations that have deeper sectoral knowledge. I'll give you one example. We have the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, a long-term financing instrument to create fiscal space for climate policies, adaptation, mitigation. We benefit tremendously from your work, from the work of the World Bank, in understanding what are the key parameters for the climate performance of a country. Where is the intensity of emissions? Where is vulnerability to shocks? So then we can draw from there macro policy conclusions and integrate it in our own work. Frankly, I think for all of us in the multilateral financial institutions, stand up and be counted. If we are not seen as delivering value for our members and not seen as working together as one, the attitudes of society towards us are not going to be fantastic. So it is a matter of every single day show that the world is better off because of our collective cooperative existence.
Well, that's a wonderful note to close on. Thank you so much for the curtain raiser speech and this really illuminating discussion. Thank you, everyone.
And thanks, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.